You think you understand power. You think you know what men will do to hold on to it. But in January 897, inside the shadowed halls of the Lateran Basilica in Rome, something happened that shattered every boundary of sanity, every pretense of civilization, every last thread holding the Church to its divine mission. Picture this: cardinals and bishops, men who had dedicated their lives to God, standing frozen in horror as their living Pope, Stephen VI, screams accusations at a corpse. Not a fresh body, not someone who died yesterday. A 9-month-old rotting cadaver, dressed in full papal regalia, propped up on the golden throne of St. Peter's successor. The dead Pope's jaw hangs slack. His decomposed face, what's left of it, seems to mock the proceedings with its permanent grimace. When the attendants lose their grip, the corpse lurches forward, nearly toppling from the throne, and grown men recoil in disgust. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't symbolic. Pope Stephen VI literally dug up his predecessor, Pope Formosus, and put his decaying remains on trial for crimes against the Church. And here's what historians don't emphasize enough. Everyone in that room knew exactly what they were witnessing. They knew this was madness. They knew this was sacrilege. But they stood there anyway, watching a deacon crouch behind the corpse, speaking in a grotesque ventriloquist act as if the dead Pope could defend himself. For the next few minutes, you're going to witness the complete destruction of everything you thought the medieval Church stood for. You'll see how one man's hatred burned so white-hot that death itself couldn't cool it. How political vengeance transformed the holiest office in Christendom into a puppet show of the damned. But more than that, you're about to discover why this trial, this Synodus Horrenda, as even contemporaries called it in horror, reveals the terrifying truth about power in the Middle Ages. Because when you understand what drove Stephen VI to commit this atrocity, when you grasp the forces that made grown men participate in this nightmare, you'll realise that the Cadaver Synod wasn't an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a system so corrupt, so twisted, that putting a corpse on trial actually made political sense. The year is 897, and in Rome, even the dead aren't safe from justice. Let me take you back to where this descent into madness truly began. Because to understand how a pope ends up screaming at a corpse, you first need to understand the world that created him. Rome in the 890s wasn't the eternal city of pilgrimages and prayers you might imagine. It was a battlefield disguised as a holy city. Between 896 and 904 alone, the Church would see 12 different popes. 12. That's more than one per year. Becoming pope in this era was, as one contemporary bitterly noted, like being diagnosed with a terminal disease. You didn't retire from the papacy, you died in it, usually violently. The streets of Rome ran with the ambitions of noble families who treated the papal throne like a prize to be won through murder and manipulation. The Spolitan dynasty, the Tusculan nobles, various factions of Roman aristocracy, they all understood one fundamental truth. Whoever controlled the Pope controlled the power to crown emperors, and whoever crowned emperors essentially controlled the Christian world. Into this viper's nest stepped Pope Formosus in 891. Now Formosus was no saint, and I mean that literally. He'd been excommunicated years earlier for excessive ambition, forced to swear an oath that he would never return to Rome or resume his clerical duties. But oaths meant nothing in 9th century church politics. By 883 he was back, pardoned, restored, climbing the ecclesiastical ladder with the determination of a man who knew his destiny. When Formosus finally claimed the papal throne, he made a choice that would literally haunt him beyond the grave. He looked at the two powers fighting over Italy, Lambert of Spoleto, the teenage duke backed by his formidable mother Agiltrude, and Arnulf of Carinthia, the Frankish king with Carolingian blood, and he chose Arnulf. This wasn't just picking sides in a political dispute. This was Formosus essentially declaring war on the Roman nobility who had controlled the papacy for decades. In February 896, he personally placed the imperial crown on Arnulf's head in St. Peter's Basilica, in front of God and everyone, explicitly rejecting Lambert's claim to the empire. Then, in one of history's most perfectly timed disasters, everything collapsed. Arnulf suffered what was probably a stroke just days after his coronation. His army melted away. And on April 4th, 896, Pope Formosus conveniently died, taking his protection with him to the grave, or so he thought. because now we need to talk about Stephen VI, the man who would become history's most unhinged pope. Stephen was a Roman, the son of a priest named John. Yes, priests had children then, that's a whole other scandal. And he had been made Bishop of Anagni by none other than Pope Formosus himself. The sources tell us something fascinating here. Stephen hadn't wanted the appointment, he'd been forced into it. Imagine carrying that resentment, being pushed into a position you never wanted by a man you probably already despised, and then, when that man dies and his enemies come knocking, offering you the highest position in Christendom if you'll just help them destroy his legacy. Stephen didn't hesitate. In May 896, just weeks after Formosus' death, Stephen claimed the papal throne with the backing of Lambert and Agiltrude. The Spoletans had their pope. Now they wanted their revenge. But here's where the story takes its turn from political manoeuvring into pure distilled insanity. It wasn't enough to simply declare Formosus' acts invalid. It wasn't enough to excommunicate him posthumously. No, Stephen VI and his Spolitan masters wanted something more. They wanted a show. They wanted humiliation so complete, so public, that it would erase Formosus from history itself. And so, on a cold January morning in 897, Pope Stephen VI gave an order that made even his supporters pause. Dig him up. Dig up Formosus. Bring me his corpse. The Lateran Basilica had seen many trials. It had witnessed excommunications, depositions, all manner of ecclesiastical justice, but it had never seen this. They dressed the corpse with shocking attention to detail. Every piece of papal regalia was meticulously placed on the rotting remains, the sacred pallium draped over shoulders that were barely holding together, the papal mitre balanced on a skull where patches of scalp still clung with wisps of hair, the fisherman's ring forced onto fingers that were more bone than flesh. They even propped a sceptre in his decomposed hand, though the fingers couldn't grip it properly. The smell must have been overwhelming. 9 months of decomposition, even with whatever primitive embalming they'd attempted, would have produced a stench that embedded itself in fabric, in hair, in the very stones of the basilica. Contemporary accounts mention clergymen fainting, others pressing cloth to their faces, trying not to vomit as Pope Stephen began his prosecution. And what a prosecution it was! Stephen VI didn't simply preside over this trial, he performed it. He paced before the corpse, gesticulating wildly, his voice rising to near hysteria as he hurled accusations at the silent defendant. "Why did you usurp the apostolic seat?" he screamed at the corpse. "You were Bishop of Porto! You swore an oath never to return to Rome." Behind the deceased pope, a young deacon crouched in the shadows, his job perhaps the most surreal in church history. When Stephen paused his ranting, when he actually demanded answers from the dead, this deacon would speak. He would provide Formosus' responses, his voice emanating from behind the corpse in a grotesque puppet show that made seasoned bishops look away in disgust. I was elected by the people of Rome," the deacon might stammer, trying to maintain this deranged fiction while presumably fighting every instinct to run from the building. "Liar," Stephen would roar back. "Perjurer, you violated sacred oaths. You abandoned your see. You were no pope. You were a usurper, a pretender, a disease upon the throne of Peter." The trial went on for hours of this madness, with Stephen working himself into greater and greater fury, while the corpse sat there, occasionally sliding to one side when the attendant's attention wavered, its head lolling at unnatural angles. At one point, according to later chronicles, the very building seemed to protest. An earthquake shook the Lateran, causing dust to rain from the ceiling, making the corpse jerk and twitch in a parody of life that sent several clergymen fleeing to the doors. But Stephen interpreted this not as divine disapproval but as confirmation. "See how even the earth rejects this pretender," he declared. "See how creation itself demands justice." The verdict was never in doubt. How could it be? The defense attorney was a corpse. The judge was a man consumed by hatred so profound it had driven him past all bounds of reason. Formosus was found guilty on all charges: perjury, violating canon law, illegally claiming the papacy, performing sacred functions as a layman. But the trial was only the beginning of Formosus' posthumous ordeal. Now came the ritual humiliation, and Stephen supervised every detail personally. First, they stripped the corpse. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, ceremonially. Each piece of papal regalia was removed with elaborate ceremony, as if they were unmaking a pope in reverse, withdrawing every honour, every dignity, every trace of the sacred office. The papal robes came off first, revealing the rotting burial shroud beneath. The mitre was lifted from the skull with mock reverence. The pallium, that symbol of papal authority, was unwound from the decomposing shoulders. They even pried the fisherman's ring from the skeletal finger, though the flesh came away with it. But Stephen wasn't finished. He ordered the corpse's right hand brought forward. These were the fingers that had blessed thousands, that had consecrated the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, that had anointed Arnulf as emperor. Stephen personally took the shears, some accounts say he used a knife, and severed 3 fingers from the corpse's right hand. The 3 fingers used for benedictions. The 3 fingers that made a pope's blessings valid. The sound, according to one account that may be embellished but captures the horror, was like breaking dry twigs. The fingers came away easily, the tendons long since rotted, leaving Formosus's hand mutilated, desecrated, destroyed. They redressed the corpse in the rough garments of a layman, a final insult to a man who had worn the most sacred vestments in Christendom. Then, on Stephen's orders, they dragged the body from the basilica. Not carried with any dignity, but literally dragged, leaving a trail of decomposition across the holy floors. First, they threw him into a common grave, the kind reserved for criminals and foreigners. But even this wasn't enough for Stephen's rage. Days later, he had the corpse exhumed yet again. This time, they dragged it through the streets of Rome. Imagine the spectacle, the horror of citizens watching a papal procession hauling a putrefying corpse through their city, all the way to the banks of the Tiber, and there, with Stephen presumably watching, they hurled Pope Formosus into the muddy waters of Rome's river. This was the ultimate damnation in Roman tradition. Since ancient times, the bodies of traitors had been cast into the Tiber, denied burial, denied memory, washed away like refuse. It was an annihilation not just of the body but of the legacy, the name, everything the person had been. Stephen VI returned to the Lateran Palace that night believing he had won. He had pleased his Spolitan masters, he had erased his predecessor, he had demonstrated that his power extended even beyond death itself. He had no idea what he had actually unleashed. The Roman people had witnessed many atrocities. They had seen popes murdered, had watched anti-popes war in the streets, had endured decades of corruption and violence. But this was different. This was a violation so fundamental, so viscerally wrong, that it transcended political loyalties. Word spread through Rome like plague. In taverns and markets, in noble houses and common dwellings, people whispered about what had happened in the Lateran. A pope had put a corpse on trial. He had mutilated the dead. He had thrown a former pope into the Tiber like garbage. And then the miracles began, or at least the stories of miracles. A fisherman claimed he had found Formosus's body caught in his nets, and when he pulled it to shore, his chronic pain vanished. A monk swore he saw lights dancing over the water where the corpse had been thrown. Another story told of how statues in St. Peter's had turned their faces away when Stephen entered, refusing to look upon the man who had committed such sacrilege. Whether these miracles were real, embellished, or completely fabricated didn't matter. What mattered was that Rome was turning against Stephen VI. The Cadaver Synod hadn't destroyed Formosus's memory, it had transformed him into a martyr. The nobility, always sensitive to shifts in popular opinion, began distancing themselves from Stephen. Even Lambert and Agiltrude, the very people who had likely ordered the trial, started to pretend they had nothing to do with it. Stephen found himself increasingly isolated, his supporters melting away like snow in summer. By July 897, just 6 months after the Cadaver Synod, the situation in Rome had become untenable. The city seethed with barely contained violence. Riots broke out near the Lateran. Mobs gathered shouting for justice for Formosus, demanding Stephen answer for his sacrilege. The exact details of what happened next vary depending on the source, but they all agree on the essential facts. A mob, possibly including members of the clergy who had been forced to participate in the Cadaver Synod, stormed the Lateran Palace. They found Stephen VI, and what happened next was swift and brutal. They stripped him of his papal vestments, just as he had stripped Formosus. They dragged him from the papal throne, just as he had dragged Formosus from his grave. They threw him into the dungeons of the Castel Sant'Angelo, the very prison where popes had traditionally held their enemies. Stephen VI, who just months before had stood as judge over the dead, now found himself judged by the living, and their verdict was as final as his had been. In August 897, Stephen VI was strangled to death in his cell. Some accounts say it was done quietly, a silk rope around the throat in the dead of night. Others claim it was more brutal, that his killers wanted him to suffer as Formosus had suffered in death. One particularly vivid account describes how they made him kneel, how they told him this was God's justice for his sacrilege, how he begged and wept before the end. We'll never know the exact truth. What we do know is that the man who had put a corpse on trial was now a corpse himself, his reign having lasted barely 15 months. The Cadaver Synod had devoured its own creator. The Church moved quickly to contain the damage. Pope Theodore II, despite reigning for only 20 days, managed to overturn everything Stephen had done. He declared the Cadaver Synod null and void. He had Formosus's body, what remained of it, fished from the Tiber and reburied with full papal honours in St. Peter's Basilica. Pope John IX went even further. He convened councils that not only condemned the Cadaver Synod, but burned every record of it they could find. They excommunicated the 7 cardinals who had actively participated. Most remarkably, they passed a law, an actual canon law, forbidding the trial of corpses. The fact that they needed to make this a law tells you everything about the state of the Church in 897. But the damage was done. The Cadaver Synod had revealed something fundamental about the papacy of this era, something that couldn't be covered up with retrials and reburials. It had shown that the throne of St. Peter had become so corrupted by temporal power that a pope could commit the ultimate sacrilege and find clergy willing to assist him. The aftermath rippled through the Church for decades. In 904, Pope Sergius III, who had been one of Stephen's supporters, actually reversed the reversal. He declared the Cadaver Synod valid once again, requiring all clergy ordained by Formosus to be reordained. The theological chaos this caused, priests unsure if their ordinations were valid, bishops questioning their authority, lasted for years. Between 896 and 904, Rome would see 12 different popes, 12 in 8 years. Most died violently, strangled like Stephen, poisoned, smothered, thrown into dungeons to rot. The papal throne had become a death sentence, and everyone knew the Cadaver Synod had opened the floodgates. If you could try a dead pope, if you could drag a corpse through the streets, then nothing was sacred anymore. Nothing was off limits. The Cadaver Synod didn't just embarrass the Church, it broke something fundamental. It proved that the Vicar of Christ could become so consumed by earthly vengeance that he'd violate the peace of the grave itself. That image, a pope screaming at a decomposing corpse while its head slowly detaches, became the perfect symbol for an institution that had completely lost its way. Stephen VI wanted to erase Formosus from history. Instead, he guaranteed they'd both be remembered forever as the starring roles in the Church's most deranged moment. Every time someone asks, "What's the worst thing a pope ever did?" the answer isn't the Borgias, it isn't the selling of indulgences, it isn't even the various murders and poisonings. It's this. It's the day a living pope put a rotting corpse on trial, severed its fingers, and threw it in a river. It's the day the Catholic Church had to pass a law saying please stop prosecuting dead people. And perhaps that's the real horror. Not that it happened, but that it made political sense to everyone involved. In the Rome of 897, this wasn't madness, it was strategy. If you want to see another absolutely insane story of medieval justice gone wrong, check out my video on 2 child princes smothered in their beds, the medieval murder mystery, because apparently the Middle Ages had no shortage of powerful men willing to commit unspeakable acts against the defenceless, whether they were sleeping children or decomposing corpses.